So sometime way back when my channel was still new, I made a video looking through some old Persona game manuals because I was feeling nostalgic for game manuals at the time. I was originally planning to do a follow-up video with another video covering other Megami Tensei game manuals, so I did some searching, gathered a pretty decent amount of them, and then I realized, wait, why waste my time covering a booklet with instructions on the bare minimum when I could be talking about a book with instructions on the whole game? So, in terms of gaming literature, strategy guides are definitely the most detailed. My first experience with strategy guides was actually alongside my first video game ever. I got a Game Boy Advance SP with Donkey Kong Country and the strategy guide packed with it. I was like 6 years old though, so even with the strategy guide, I could never beat the game. I gave up at the Ice World. The rest of my experience with these books was just from sitting in the video game section of Walmart while my parents went grocery shopping. I specifically remember staring at the pages of the Pokemon strategy guides a lot. It felt like I was absorbing the knowledge of these mystifying tomes. In practice, it might seem kinda scummy to design a game to be daunting and cryptic just to get people to buy a book that tells people how to win. And I mean, kinda. But you can't deny there's something alluring and enjoyable about the mystique around revealing a game's secrets, and Megami Tensei is a perfect series to make an example of here. I'll be doing things a bit differently here. I'll be tackling these strategy guides in the order their respective games released. Of course, I have to absolutely take a look at Megami Tensei for the Famicom. I personally haven't played the game yet, but I can imagine this game being a real pain to play back in the day without a strategy guide. For that, we're gonna consult the Certain Victory Strategy Guide Perfect Edition. You'll notice that a few of these guides have perfect in the title throughout this video. I should also note that a good number of these are gonna be in Japanese, and I don't know Japanese. Using my expert knowledge in guesswork, however, I think I can infer what kind of info these books are trying to convey given the context. Here's the story page. I like how the layout of this page kinda matches the opening of the game. You got your character profiles for Nakajima and Yumiko, as well as an explanation of what each of the stats do. Pretty standard. I think this page is actually giving a good starting stat build to go with for both Nakajima and Yumiko. So I suppose if you really did want to have a perfect run, you'd have to follow what this guide says to do exactly. In a way, you could say this is a way of getting the absolute most out of a game. The book then meticulously explains just about everything about the interface and every command in battle. Here are pages showing what the entire dungeon structure looks like. Apparently, the entire setting of the game is laid out like a Mario level select screen. Every single facet of the gameplay, in fact, is explained in detail, from dungeon crawling, to generating a password, to shop mechanics. Skipping a bit forward, you have a long list of every demon in the game with their stats, including bosses. You got your fusion chart as well, pretty standard. I like the one page with an actual screen cap from the OVA, that's pretty neat. Alright, now on to what most people look to these guides for. This book shows a nice little graphic at the beginning of each area's section, showing where the floors are relative in a 3D space. This is actually pretty helpful considering how the dungeon crawling is in first person, thus replicating a sort of 3D space. Some of these layouts get pretty elaborate. They're honestly kinda cool to look at though. There's also a little flowchart sort of outlining the itinerary for that section of the game. And of course, you have the maps of every floor and the locations of important shit throughout said maps. You also get some notes and screenshots of what I'm assuming are important key things you'll have to do on these floors. Jumping way forward to much later in the game, you have the infamous section where you must place the gems into Izanami in the right order, and if you mess up, you are literally sent back to the beginning of the game. After reaching the final boss and the ending of the game, the book then shows all the dungeon maps again without any of the notes. I know I abridged a lot of that, I think I got my point across though. Also, I probably can't really read any more into what's being shown to me without knowing Japanese. Overall, a very neat guidebook. Next, let's take a look at the Shin Megami Tensei I Official Perfect Guide. This book covers the PlayStation version. On the bottom right corner of the cover, it says Cool, Sharp, Superior, and Ultimate Guidebook. Now that's a flex. I'm also a fan of this cover art. I like the supporting characters standing in the back and Hazama is just creeping behind the gate over there. It's kind of ruined when you flip the page and see the protagonist's leg go over the bush though. It really throws off the perspective they kinda had going there. Flip the page again to see a nice pic of Tamaki in a distorted school entrance at what looks like the shoe lockers. There's also a little demon chilling in the back there. Character profiles actually have entire pages dedicated to the character's art. I'm not a big fan of the protagonist's page. Just looking at the page, I can immediately see that they scaled Tamaki slightly bigger than the male protagonist. Her head is bigger than his. And the way they place her on the page makes her look taller. It's canon, guys. On to the actual guide content. As you can imagine, a lot of the type of info you'll see will be similar across all of these first-person dungeon-style games. For the sake of not repeating myself, I'll only be covering stuff that's unique to this game. I'm also noticing there are a lot less visuals and graphics in this guide, and I also haven't really played this game either, so I'm basically illiterate for a lot of these pages. So at the beginning of SMT If, the game will ask you a few questions that will actually affect your main character's initial stat build. This guide will actually tell you how the answers will affect your stats. It also shows the initial stats of all possible ally characters you can choose to go the entire game with. Here's a small section explaining how acquiring Guardians works. It's not that complicated. You die. Here's the page that actually explains what a Guardian is and how it affects your character. Much more helpful. Now this guide actually gets into the 3 normal routes of the game, or Route A as they're referred to. It even shows you which parts of the game you'll experience in each route, and which parts get skipped depending on your partner. Here's a list of map icons. I hope you all remember these. They're gonna be on the test. Each area of the game has an itinerary at the beginning before getting into more detail, just like the last book we looked at. Another nice detail is that at the top, you can see which partner route this section applies to. The next large portion of the book is essentially dedicated to Route B, or the Akira route exclusive to New Game Plus. As we all know, you go through an entirely different set of areas if you choose Akira as your partner. Afterwards, we have our complete database of demons starting from Light Law aligned, going all the way down to Dark Chaos. This is appropriately followed up with a database of the Guardians you can acquire, a list of skills in the game, items, etc. Okay, I didn't realize this until this specific page, but you'll notice that it says Maniac Room of Digital Devil Story If. The only other time I saw the game referred to by that title was in a re-upload of a tool-assisted speedrun of the game. I wasn't sure if it was actually an alternative title for it or not, but I guess this confirms it. The Digital Devil Story moniker still lingers in a few places if you look hard enough. Next up is Revelations Persona for the PlayStation. I wasn't able to find any full scans, but I was able to get some good quality images of an English strategy guide provided to me by one of my patrons. I'd like to extend a special thanks to Board Choco for being kind enough to send me these pics, as well as the rest of my patrons and channel members for their support. Here's a page of the book's credits. I'm pretty positive that this list of credits is longer than the English team's credits in the actual game. Let's read a little bit of the Ed Zone and see what kind of insight this book has to offer. I'd like to open this Persona strategy guide with a thought. Persona may be one of the single most important RPGs to ever come out in America. To the inevitable question, why? I give you this answer. Persona is groundbreaking. Simply put, it is one of the first major console RPGs to throw away the traditional sword and sorcery type game with the valiant knights and the evil magician and the princess or kingdom in need of rescue. Instead, we are given a ragtag group of high school students, complete with present-day lifestyles, personalities, and problems. Instead of a vast world with its rolling plains, rugged mountaintops, and quaint villages, We are thrust into a bleak, dark, and cold city with paved streets and looming buildings. In the place of the typical dragon, goblin, or orc, we are pitted against the very spawn of Hades and worse, the many humans consumed by them. Persona is fresh. Persona is different. Wow, couldn't have said it better myself. But I can't help but feel like that could also describe another game, perhaps one that people compare every indie RPG to. It's on the tip of my tongue, but I just can't quite remember it. Here's what one of the character profiles looks like. Here you can see we have a full art of Nanjo, or Nate as he's called in this version of the game. I can't help but be reminded of Persona 5's character cut-ins when I see the one for Nate here. We also have an inspiring quote from the man himself. "There is nothing that I cannot do." What a trooper. We also have a brief description and his stat spread underneath that. We're also shown the best personas to give to said character. In Nate's case, there's a heavy emphasis on the Hierophant, with some of the World Arcana, and one persona of the Death Arcana. Here's a page explaining the grid system in battle. It basically covers battle formations, attack range, and area of effect. Moving on to Soul Hackers, I was actually able to find 3 different strategy guides for this game. One of them just calls the game Soul Hackers, while another guide actually refers to the game as Shin Megami Tensei Devil Summoner 2. I mean, I guess it makes sense. At this point in time, this was the only other Devil Summoner game, and it pretty much plays just like the original Devil Summoner. The one I'm gonna be browsing through in this video will be the Soul Hackers no Subite guide, mostly because it's already conveniently scanned in JPEG form for me to import straight into my editing software. So first you're introduced to some of the characters such as the Alpha and Beta brothers, Kadokura, Kinap, and Victor. You're then shown the Vision Quest characters. In case you're not in the know-how, Vision Quests are essentially parts of the game where you temporarily play as a character in a flashback. Once again, I'm not sure if this is just because of how they scaled the artwork, or if Urabe is just a short stack compared to Judah and Naomi. We've got a nice stylistic collage of screenshots and random character portraits throughout the game. Right off the bat, I can tell you immediately that these pages are much more pleasing to look at. Lots of demon art sprawling across the pages, and the bottom section of each page is dedicated to either characters or some lore or story bit. They even recap Kyoji Kuzunoha and the bodies he's possessed. We got a tutorial for Sword Fusion 2, or as the book calls it, Combine of the Sword. Here's a page showing what spells Namissa will learn depending on how you answer a certain question at the beginning of the game. Here's a page dedicated to the Frost 5. It's as colorful as you'd expect it to be. It's at this point where the book moves on to the World Guide, which is essentially where the guide to the actual game begins. Then you've got your databases again, which is pretty standard. Now let's take a look at Prima's official strategy guide for Persona 2 Eternal Punishment. Contact System and All Rumors Exposed. Unfortunately, this strategy guide is in black and white. Here's an introduction page explaining how this game is a separate timeline from the one in Innocent Sin, and giving a small recap of the end of that game. Then we're thrown immediately into the character profiles. Descriptions and persona compatibility are listed on the same page, and they actually fit 2 characters per page. I like how they didn't even bother getting a picture of Gozen, and they say so little about him that this part might as well tell you nothing. You've got an explanation of the different game modes, your world map screen, your town overworlds, the 3D dungeons, and your event maps. The next few pages are just standard things like combat, demon contact, and rumors before going into the walkthrough proper. Wow, they jump into things a lot faster than the Japanese guides we've looked at. I kind of like it though, not gonna lie. They don't give you any super detailed maps for most of the early dungeons like in the other guides, but they leave detailed enough descriptions and labeled images to guide you in the right direction. They have a boss section that doesn't give detailed data about the boss itself, but does give you the writer's recommended strategy for going about the fight. The walkthrough will also list items and enemies you can encounter in their own small sections. They even show you which characters will give you the most desirable reactions for each demon. Of course, they also provide separate sections depending on whether you choose Nanjo or Ellie as your 5th party member. After the main walkthrough, the guide goes into all the extra dungeons, including, well, X Dungeon. This guide isn't as detailed as the Japanese guides, but straight to the point and gets the job done. Alright, now we finally reached the PlayStation 2 era of Megaten games. And of course, what better place to start than Double Jump's Shin Megami Tensei III Nocturne official strategy guide. We've got an explanation of the changes in the Maniacs version, which is what the Western versions of Nocturne are based on. They explain how New Game Plus works right off the bat, which is interesting. Okay, let's skip the formalities like the gameplay explanations and get into the real meat of this guide. Here's a page dedicated to explaining the game's reasons. The neutral, chaos, and destruction endings are actually referring to what the fans refer to as the freedom, demon, and true demon endings respectively. Here's an explanation of Magatama. You've got an explanation of attack and resist attributes, and here's an explanation of the press turn battle system. This is the first game to introduce this system, so I figured it was worth showing this. It's a pretty in-depth explanation of how press turns are consumed and how you can lose them. The guide also gives some tips and advice like covering your allies' weaknesses with your own resistances and not trying to preserve items too vehemently. I have a bad habit of doing that myself that I have a hard time letting go. They give you a list of all possible demon evolutions, definitely worth looking at if I ever replay the game. There's an explanation of skill mutations and skill upgrades. They explain that skills will usually mutate into a random skill of the above tier, but some skills will straight up change into their upgraded form. For example, single target magic spells will become multi-target magic spells. Void passives will upgrade into drain passives. This page is kind of dated, but here's a page explaining the rules of skill inheritance. They even show a nice chart explaining the odds of a skill getting rolled in randomization process. Be careful not to transfer useless skills. Thanks, really needed to hear that. I know the remaster just lets you handpick what skills get passed on. And now for an artwork intermission. There's nothing inherently interesting about the walkthrough itself. It's pretty standard stuff that we've seen already. However, it is the only way to see full views of the overworld maps. Here's some background info on the fiends in development. Apparently the locations of all the fiend fights were kept secret and were not allowed to be printed in Japanese guides. This led to a lot of playground talk and rumors. You know what I mean, right? Mew under the truck in Pokemon, or in this case, I found a super secret special boss that totally kicked my ass. Those were magical times. And the rest is pretty much what you'd expect from the other strategy guides we've seen today. Here's something a little different for you. The double jump guide for Devil Summoner Raidou Kuzunoha versus the Soulless army. This book has pretty nice looking pages. I like the flowers scattered around the corners of the pages. After the character introductions, the book takes a sudden turn and goes into a culture and history lesson. I understand the westernization of Japan and the time period this game is based on is kind of important to the story. I just wasn't really expecting this in a strategy guide of all things. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, this game is a hack and slash game rather than a turn-based RPG, so of course battles are going to work differently than most other Megaten games. Basic action game fundamentals aside, you also use demons differently than in other games. Here's the catching tutorial, a list of demon personalities, and the types of commands you can give to your demon familiars. I've only played a little bit of this game myself, so it might actually be a good idea for me to read through this guide as I'm playing to familiarize myself with its different gameplay. I'm looking forward the most to learning fusion mechanics. No, this is not me asking you to explain everything about the game to me in the comments. I literally have all the information on my computer to do that for me. Don't leave obnoxious, unwarranted advice for these games, please. So the game is split up into episodes, so each one is outlined at the beginning of their respective sections in the guidebook. Neat. The maps in this book take up entire pages, and all have a nice hand-drawn look to them, as opposed to the usual grid-like look that most other dungeon maps have. But wait, that's only the beginning. The actual walkthrough of the game starts right after all the dungeon, demon, and item gathering info. This is where you start seeing stuff like forced encounters and boss info, and more detailed text guidance. We've got a section of secrets and side quests, namely the training halls. We also have second cycle info. I didn't know this game had a hard mode, but it's locked behind the second cycle. Based on the description the guide gives on it though, it definitely sounds like something I'd rather save for a second playthrough. The rest of it is pretty standard Megami Tensei Strategy Guide material. Up until the very end, that is. We actually get a Q&A interview at the end of the book. I'll look forward to reading that after I beat the game. I wasn't able to find an English strategy guide for Persona 3, but I was able to find the Persona 3 Fest official perfect guide. Oh yeah, baby. Japan's guides are still on their perfect streak, even years later. Of course, I can't really be the judge of that because I can't read it, but I can give you the general rundown of what's in the book. Here's the character introductions, basically just showing you these as a formality at this point. There's a full-on guide explaining the overall structure and system of the game, which was relatively new at the time. This is mostly stuff we've been over in my game manuals videos, so we'll skip to the parts I find especially worth mentioning. The story section actually lays out a full schedule of events of what will happen on a day-by-day basis. From what I can tell, it will tell you when mandatory social link ranks will happen, as well as what social links are available on said day, but is not a full-on social link guide. You'll have to consult GameFAQs for that. Fun fact, Penguin Knight's Max Social Link Guide actually references this book. After each month's schedule, it then actually goes through and gives the rundown on the events of that month. You'll notice that some of the right pages have a mini column at the bottom explaining relevant gameplay tips as they come up. For example, May's event section has a mini column about how character condition works. At the end of each month, it'll give you a breakdown of the full moon mission and the boss following. Also, the book has an entire section for Tartarus. Or no, sorry, Tartaros. You get a nice blurb on all the Guardian Shadows too, or Keepers as the book refers to them. Very nice. Now we get on to the part covering actual social link stuff, particularly the dialogue choices, and also how many points are required to reach to the next rank. Interestingly enough, the quest section will include the boss data for both the Reaper and Elizabeth, since they neither fall into story nor keeper bosses. They are also the only quest-based battles in the game, so I suppose it makes sense. But we're not done just yet, folks. There's still half the book dedicated to the Answer, or Episode Aegis in Japan. The entire scenario takes place on one specific day and is pretty much entirely dungeon crawling, so of course, it's mostly just gonna be dungeon info. Along with the persona data of all the personas the protagonist can use, you also have the personas of your party members, both their journey and answer variants. Finally, you've got your enemy data, which isn't anything special. I just felt like pointing out that the book has 2 whole ass pages dedicated to Nick's avatar's many phases. The rest is pretty standard. In total, the strategy guide is about 400 pages, the longest strategy guide we've looked at yet. To wrap up the PS2 era and our strategy guide excursion in general, we've got Double Jump's Persona 4 strategy guide. There's not much that's different I can point out in this guide compared to the Persona 3 guide. One thing I must complain about is that the PDF I found online is missing Yosuke's character introduction. I also have no idea why they made all the side characters look miserable on these pages, but it's kind of funny. This guide's day planner shows all possible social links available every day, but doesn't push you towards any in particular. You're just given the options and are encouraged to go for whoever you want to hang out with. There's a section explaining Fusion Forecast, which is a mechanic exclusive to Persona 4, and another interview at the very end just like the Raidou guide. The rest is pretty much identical to the Persona 3 Fest guide. Speaking of which, I made a promise months ago that if Persona 4 got ported to Switch, I'd make a video talking about it. That's gonna take a while to play through and record footage for, so I'll need to figure out what to release between now and then. And as we close the cover on this last strategy guide, we close the book on an era where information like this was greatly coveted to the point where people were willing to spend money for it. Nowadays, everyone kinda has the expectation of being able to beat a game without any sort of guidance, and it's sort of discouraged now. Funnily enough, I actually saw Omori release an official walkthrough guide and art book. Yeah, who remembers back when I talked about that game? So yeah, I suppose the art isn't entirely dead. As for the old strategy guides of the past, all we could do now is download and share PDFs of whatever we can find. If you actually own any strategy guides physically, I highly encourage you to make scans of them and upload them to archive.org or somewhere else. I feel like this type of literature is worth preserving. Because I'm too dumb to read real books or something. I don't know. I will provide links to all the strategy guides I referenced in this video in the description if you would like to look at all of them in more detail. I know this video barely covered what's in these books, so if you want more, I highly encourage you to take a look for yourself. And for general advice on how to find strategy guides on your own, Google is your friend. And if Google doesn't work, you can always try looking on archive.org. That's where I got the vast majority of these guides. Thank you guys for watching.